tonight's Living New Deal webinar, Ranger of the Lost Art. I'm Harvey Smith, a founding board member and project advisor of the Living New Deal. The Living New Deal is a nonprofit organization founded at UC Berkeley about a dozen years ago. Our mission is to preserve the New Deal's legacy nationwide, to make people aware of what the New Deal accomplished, and to promote a new Deal today. We are documenting the physical legacy of the New Deal in cities, towns, and rural areas across the country. There was a time when our government put people to work building post offices, city halls, parks, schools, libraries, roads, bridges, sidewalks, and producing a trove of public artworks. You can learn more about the New Deal and its pivotal role in the nation's recovery from the Great Depression and search thousands of New Deal sites at livingnewdeal.org. Tonight's webinar, Ranger of the Lost Art, is part of a series of free public programs exploring what the New Deal did and what a new Deal could do today. Our guest, Doug Leen, will be doing that tonight in this discussion about the WPA Post Division and the Western Museum Laboratory here in Berkeley, California. The WPA turned out thousands of posters promoting public health, art, literacy, conservation, and travel, including to our national parks, while providing jobs for unemployed graphic designers and printmakers. Ranger Doug, a dentist and tugboat captain in Alaska, began his pursuit to locate and preserve national park posters more than 50 years ago, becoming something of a New Deal historian in the process. Please join the conversation by writing your questions into the Q&A, and Doug will answer them at the end of his talk. Thank you for joining us and your support for the Living New Deal. You can sign up on our website to receive our newsletter, updates, and invitations. We hope you will. Your donations make our work and programs like this available to everyone. We welcome your support. Welcome and thank you, Doug Leen, for being with us tonight. Doug, take it away.
I'm doing the screen share. And can you all see that screen?
You're good.
Good. Well, Harvey asked me to tell a little bit about what I do and don't do. I'm not a historian. I'm not a writer for sure, an author, although I just did write a book on the subject of this material, but I do recall getting a very poor grade in English in high school and I deserved it. But I'm actually in real life, I'm a dentist. It's just been a lifelong passion in dentistry for some reason. I first ran a private practice in downtown Seattle for 20 years in the Pike Place market. It was a kind of a last minute decision. And it was, I called it my sports car practice. It was just a lot of fun. But after 20 years, I kind of outgrew the city life and wanted to do the rural adventure. So I moved to Alaska. This is right after 9/11. There were a shortage of doctors up there and the phone rang off the hook. And basically worked for the underserved communities in Alaska, native communities particular, mainly on a boat. The upper left tugboat is my hobby restoration, and otherwise we flew in airplanes around all the small villages. I worked from Barrow, Alaska, literally to the South Pole, leaving Alaska, of course. And there I did dentistry on icebreakers, flew into the South Pole, and otherwise was a dentist at the hospital at McMurdo Sound. But anyway, that was a season of 04 and 05. And I pretty much retired from dentistry in 2015. But before I became a dentist, I was a park ranger. And this was again, a spontaneous decision made probably in a few minutes when something fell through in another job after I graduated in 1970. I had a degree in geology. So I went to the Grand Tetons and took over a friend's job that he retired and worked up in this upper left little ranger station up here. I worked in mountain rescue in Grand Teton National Park. It was a wonderful job, paid $3.10 an hour. Got to fly in that little rickety helicopter you see in the background on the second photograph there. That was built by some high school kid with an erector set, I think. in a little glass bubble. We'd fly up to 11,000 feet was the maximum elevation that we could get it on a warm day, but it was an adventure. The third photograph down is me standing in front of the rescue cache, which is where we had our ranger station at the time. And the very bottom right is the Jenny Lake Museum, which is the subject of the first poster that was made of Grand Teton National Park. And this photograph was taken by Ansel Hall in 1934 when he did a survey of the potential museum sites around the United States. So this is where the story began, was for me, was in this barn. This was built by the CCC. It was a horse corral. And it was part of the Beaver Creek community, which is where the Park Service housed all their employees. And back in the 1929 was the formation of the park, same year as the Depression. And they shortly thereafter, they built this community. I lived in the house on the right, and then in the barn on the left, on a park cleanup day, I found this old poster hanging up in that barn, all dusty and kind of out of sight. And I pulled it down. Everything was going to go up to the burn pile. But I took this outside and dusted it off in the daylight and looked at it. And I first thought that this must be part of something better than just one off print. You know, it was made on hardboard. It was very well done. And would there be other parks, or would there be other copies? I didn't know. And it turns out that, yes, there were other copies. One on the left and right here turned up later, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But anyway, the other thing I came to the conclusion of was that this is not going to go to the park dump. So I took it home to my cabin up at Lupin Meadows at Jenny Lake. And this was my only real art decoration in the cabin for 6 years. And then it went back to college with me. And as they say, the rest is history. But 20 years later, the phone rang. And it was my boss's, the former boss's wife, who ran the bookstore at the visitor center in Moose, the town of Moose. This is park headquarters today. And she was explaining that this building, that the Jenny Lake Museum that I'd worked in, was being moved off the shoreline of the Jenny Lake for ecological reasons. And they were putting it on the other side of the glacial moraine, and they wanted to do a commemorative poster. She asked me if I had any ideas, and I said, do I have an idea? I've got the poster. And I sent her a picture of this thing. And the first thing she said, well, send it to me and I'll make some reproductions of it. And I said, no, it'll end up in the dump again. I'll never see it again. And so I said, besides all the screen printers are up here in the city of Seattle, so why don't we do the heavy lifting up here, and I'll work on all the details, and we'll reprint this thing. So we reprinted it, and Park was not really interested in doing a second reprint. We sold it for $20. I think I lost my shirt, and I think the company that printed it was a t-shirt company, and they lost their shirt on the adventure as well. But it was a lot of fun. We sold 500 of these reproductions. So I got the idea I'd make up a Yellowstone print, and we'd sell these side by side, and the sales would potentiate each other. And so I started to ask Charlene, well, where do you think this poster came from? And she said, well, it's an old government print. That's all she could tell me. And so I wrote the government. They had 3 or 4 prints in their Library of Congress collection at the time, and virtually nothing. This is when you look to stamp. It took 6 weeks to get an answer. And finally, Charlene said, no, you want to go to the Library of Congress. You don't want to go to the Library of Congress. You want to check with the Harper's Ferry archives of the National Park Service. So I called up Tom Durant there, and quite by coincidence, he was working with Grand Canyon, and he had dug through his file drawer, and he found this print right here in this negative, and he held it up to the light, and he was discussing with Grand Canyon what the provenance was, and he dug up a letter, which you'll see in a minute here. So I talked to Tom. I said, well, is there a picture of a poster or photograph, I should say, of Grand Teton? And he said, yes, there is. And I said, read me the headline. And he said, meet the ranger naturalist at Jenny Lake Museum. And this was the holy grail that I've been looking for. He said, Doug, I've got 13 black and white negatives. There's some more here, by the way, that are not park related. There's the displays down here, and there's a wildlife one that they made. But anyway, there were 13 national parks. So I had a patient in Seattle who was Northwest Regional Director at the time, and he facilitated getting me a copy of these negatives. So I blew them up at a photo lab, and this is what I came up with. And we made the width dimension at 13.5 inches to match the Jenny Lake print. but all the heights were different because of the parallax of the cameras. These were taken with just a big 4x5 format camera. So from these black and white photographs, and they were not easy to decipher, if you can follow me here and look it up here. There's no clouds, no detail of the far rim. There's sections missing. This section we filled in. You can see here it's dark here where they put the campfire program. Here it was missing. So for about 5 years, I hired an artist and we took apart, dismembered these prints. Now this Grand Canyon, when we had a color print by then, of course, because Grand Canyon was looking at their provenance. So I went out to a phone booth after this meeting I went out to meet with Tom Durand, and after the meeting, I went over to a phone booth and I called the phone number at the Grand Canyon Park. And I said, where are you in this process of reproducing your Grand Canyon print? And they said, well, we gave up on it. And I said, well, why is that? And he said, well, it's too expensive. So I said, well, I've got this company in Seattle. I just kind of made it up, I guess. And I said, we reproduce old WPA poster art of the National Park Service. And literally this company just flashed in my brain in 5 minutes during this phone conversation. So they sent me the color photograph and we took it all apart like you see here, and we started anew. It took 5 years to separate these out. There were 84 screens in the 13 negatives, but this was the crux of this effort. It was a horrific amount of time and effort, but we paid for it through the sales of these reproductions. Now, these were not posters that were made back in the 1930s, to 38 to 41. These were not for sale. They were made for advertising our national parks. These are the only two photographs I found of, if you look right above these two boys' head here, there's the Yellowstone Falls poster hanging behind the ranger here in his desk. And then over here in Wind Cave on the right-hand photograph, here's the Wind Cave poster. Now this poster has never been found. So that and the other photograph you saw a minute ago was the only information I had to reproduce this photograph. So how did this all begin? And that was my big burning question. And I did not really understand until about 3 years ago. Thank you, Kathleen Duxbury, for pointing me in the direction of the NARA facilities in San Bruno, California. And there was 1 decade of records there, and it all pointed back to this one man, Fridtjof Fryxell. And he was the first chief naturalist in Grand Teton National Park. He came out, had an English and biology major. He was so stunned by the Tetons, he went back to Chicago. He got a degree in geology. And he came back and he was, for 6 or 7 years, worked in Grand Teton National Park. And in 1934, he was recruited out to work at the museum laboratories in Berkeley, California. Now he wrote a master plan, if you will, for Grand Teton National Park and how to interpret the park. Most of these peaks were not climbed because the Grand Teton was the main focus. So he did most of the first ascents in the Tetons. He wrote trail projections of where they should go and how to be interpreted. It was 20, 30 pages. He had all the maps and details. And this sat on the director of the Park Service's desk, who was Horace Albright at the time. And it sat for 3 years between 1929, the Depression, and when FDR became president and appointed Harold Ickes as the Secretary of Interior, and he appointed Arno Kammer as the third director of the Park Service. Arno Kammer picked this report up and said, we've got to get this guy out to Berkeley here. So the bottom here, you can read here, it says we want to reassign him to the educational headquarters laboratories. So that's how Fryxell was invited out to Berkeley. And at the same time, the federal money was rolling in, and the Park Service had this fragmented group of buildings where they were producing a minimal amount of museum displays here at College Avenue, Euclid Avenue, and Durant Avenue. But now they could afford with some WPA monies, and they were hiring artists like mad. They housed them in this building at Fulton Street, 2223 Fulton. And they got a 2-year lease. It was $700 a month and had 20,000 square feet with wide open windows so the artists could sit back and do their stuff. This is how the building looked, by the way, 2 years ago before they tore it down. And if I would have torn it down too, if it looked like that. It was some architect really got a hold of it. But anyway, the building's gone today. But back in the 30s, this is where the artists came and did their their crafts and art. And we found one artist we've identified as Elizabeth Janot sitting back here. And here's a more of a close-up picture of her at her job. So this was pretty much what they did all day long. And they were paid 70 cents an hour. The WPA artists and the CCC boys that ran the presses were paid $1 a day, as we all know. This was so popular, this Western Museum Laboratories, that they've created a similar one in the eastern part of the country, and of all places, Ford's Theater, where Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. And the Eastern Museum labs, there weren't as many posters made for Eastern parks. They're mainly military parks. In fact, the 3 parks that were made back in the 38 to 41 era were made in Berkeley of the Eastern parks. Great Smoky Mountains is one of them. Moving on here, the Ansel Hall was put in charge of this Western Museum lab. They only served 2 years, from 1935 to 37. In 37, he kind of abruptly retired. He went over to Mesa Verde and he started a private museum. And in his place was his assistant that took over, and he was Dor Yeager. And Dor Yeager came out of Colorado, the Rocky Mountain National Park, and he was a bit of a character, as you can see. Rode his three-wheel motorcycle, and he wore his Park Service badge up here in his hat like a policeman. He was, would have liked to have met that fellow. But anyway, he ran it until 1942, and by then the World War II was going full blast. Museum Lab started with a hand-picked group of 30 CCC boys that they recruited out of the nearby national parks. And Ansel Hall, coming from Yosemite, he was a big proponent of maps and interpreting national parks with maps. And of course, they're important. And he built these 3-dimensional maps. So this became the starting point for his interpretation exhibits. So this crew of 30 that were handpicked later grew to about 250. So it was staffed by ECW, which later became the CCC, the PWA, WPA, this Alphabet Soup Federal Arts Project, and the National Youth Association, I believe. So anyway, and this was an important contribution. They got quite a few young students that were learning a tremendous amount of information and really helped out with this project. Over on the right is Ansel Hall and Dor Yeager standing on the steps at Hillgard Hall. This is the very beginning of their endeavor here. This photograph I found in this decade of records just astounded me. And this is probably the most important photograph ever taken, I think, in the National Park Service, by the National Park Service. This is Herbert, on the right is Herbert Collins. He was a portrait artist, painted the portraits of the secretaries and directors of the Park Service. He painted a lot of the big murals in Devil's Tower, Grand Teton National Park, and he was the artist of artists in National Park lore at the time. Brixell, of course, is in the middle here. He took his knickers off and put on a suit. And over here on the left is William Henry Jackson, the 1872 Ferdinand Hayden survey. He was 92 years old, I believe, when this photograph was taken. But here they are, 3 titans of history on the porch of the hill this is the Fulton Street facility here. So the posters began amidst the maps and amidst the dioramas. The dioramas were the initial idea for the graphic art for Grand Teton National Park. And that was the first poster made. It was begun with this letter here in August 26, 1938. They made 100 prints. They were $12 a 100. They cost 12 cents a piece. In my opinion, is probably the best deal that American taxpayers have ever received. They were quite chagrined about this Grand Teton poster and were because of the lettering was not quite perfect and this kind of thing, and we would do better in the future. And I think the Teton print is actually one of the best designs there is. It was the first and I think the best, and only 4 colors. So here's Ansel Hall here with, I'm sorry, this is Dor Yeager here with Robert Fechner, who was the head of the CCC at the time. This letter, by the way, was from Dor Yeager, and it was addressed to Mr. Pinkley. He was Frank Boss Pinkley, and he was another character in the Park Service who came out to the Southwest Monuments and kind of just started volunteering his time. And he was so upset about the pilfering and the pot shards and all these things that were going on with a lot of these areas that were needed to be protected. And he later stayed with the Park Service, made a life career within the Park Service. I believe he died at the podium giving a speech. But anyway, he was the first stop, I guess you'd say, for the poster division. This is the artist was later, just recently, I should say, within 15 years ago, C. Don Powell's name came to the surface, and it was kind of a tortuous route to find out who this man was. His name appeared briefly on the internet, and then it disappeared again. But this photograph showed up with Dale Miller and C. Don Powell here at Avonis Press. And Powell was born in Kansas. He studied art in Chicago. He met his wife there. They moved out to San Francisco, started an art business. They actually took their honeymoon to San Francisco, and they sold their return trip ticket. They liked it so much, but the stinking fogs of the Pacific Coast didn't agree with them. So they moved over the bay into Berkeley. And from about 1929, after the Depression hit, there was no record of Powell until he resurfaced at the Western Museum Laboratories in 1936. And so what he was doing is he was first working on a road crew there. And one of his shovel mates, I guess you call him, said, "Hey, they're hiring artists over at Berkeley. You ought to go over there and see if you trade your shovel in for an easel and a paintbrush." And that's what he did. So he began designing these prints, and there's 3 or 4 in succession here that I'll show you that I've actually caught him at the desk designing some of these. This is the only photograph taken with Powell's name and his face. And so from this, we've extrapolated all these others. This is the Zion diorama being built. This is the Teton diorama being built. This took 3 years to build. And this is not Powell, but the artwork is pretty obvious here that this is what the genesis for the idea for the Grand Teton print was. This was cut in half with a chainsaw in 5 minutes. Took 3 years to build. And in 1973, it was cut in half because it wouldn't fit out the door of the ranger station. It went up to the park dump. So a sad ending. So here's C. Don Powell with Dale Miller, a little larger picture at the press here. And Dale Miller, we think, is his initials that are in the seal. They couldn't sign their artwork. It was WPA artists couldn't take credit for their work because they were government employees. But we think that they surreptitiously scratched their initials on the screen. So this could be Dale Miller. I'm pretty certain it is, but who's EM? So this took some sleuthing. But in the back of the Teton print that turned up in Los Angeles by an art collector, I ended up buying this print over the phone, donated it to the park, but I had never seen the back of it. And on the back of it, they penned out a poster they were going to make for a Wildcat Canyon Christmas dance on December 22nd, 1939. And here's mathematics for all the screen printing and the borders and how much screen they needed to build to purchase, I guess, and how much space they wanted, land areas around the edges and whatnot. And some of the mathematics I went over, and it's not very good. But anyway, in this Wildcat Canyon camp was a fellow named Ed Monk, and he could be the person that scratched his initials in the Yellowstone screens. Another photograph I found, which was pretty incredible, was the Jenny Lake print being printed. And you notice the CCC boys are dressed up in Army uniforms, coat, ties, their hair's combed and cut. This is the print. If you take this into Photoshop and kind of stretch it around, you end up with here. And we can see that we're 2 inks down and 2 to go. And these are the drying racks they use. They just they stack these up like decks of cards. Kind of innovative. This was, again, the diorama in its finished state, and you can see the resemblance here of the art form. And these are the 3 surviving prints out of the 100 that we found today so far. You'll notice the right-hand print is quite a bit redder. This came out of a plant press in White Sands, New Mexico National Monument. And notice that the left side of the print is cut off and the bottom is cut off, so it would fit in the plant press. So this is the only intact one here and the one on the left. And this is the one I found in the barn in 1971. Another picture of C. Don Powell working on designing the Yosemite print. And notice these smaller versions. And this is what we did in our screen shops in Seattle 30 years ago when we first started doing this, was to test the registration of the different screens. So this kind of is very interesting photograph here. I think one line here in that he's putting in here of the events in the park were Indian demonstrations. And the park wanted me to take that out when I reprinted this. I wouldn't do it. And it was not so much because it was original art. I wouldn't change the original art. But when I was a park ranger, we got called into the superintendent's office. And there was an Indian uprising, an Indian demonstration, if you will, by the Sioux Indians, and they'd taken over Mount Rushmore. Many of you probably remember this. And they lowered dynamite down next to George Washington's nose, and they're going to blow his nose off. They didn't get their demand. So Rob Wallace and I were called in to the chief ranger's office and told to pack our bags. We're going to go up to the park and settle things, I guess. But we never did. But after that experience, I thought, well, I'm not going to take the word Indian demonstrations out for two reasons. This is Anthony Valonis at his press. This innovation, this mousetrap, better mousetrap, if you will, it looked like a bit like a mousetrap, enabled the WP artist to print, we think, up to 2 million posters in 8 years. It was a tremendous, prolific amount of artwork, 35,000 designs. Only 14 of these 35,000 were parks. They only made 100 each, more or less, 50 to 100, we think. The silk would break down. But only 2,000 of these remain. At least that's the latest guesstimate. So that's 1/10 of 1%. So if you do the math in reverse, 99.9% of this public poster art is gone forever. 34,000 designs. Congress, just like today, back then was trying to cut funding for national parks over and over and over. And it's been a chronic problem. It was when I was a park ranger in the 70s. We got laid off 2 and 3 times a summer, had to take furloughs and this kind of thing. So Ansel Hall and Dora Yeager came up with this idea. This probably was Dora Yeager because it's in the poster area, but they made exhibits of the materials that the Western Museum Labs were making. And these are some of the miscellaneous exhibits, maps and whatnot. Over here on the right are the dioramas and how they were made. Some of the photographs you saw earlier. And then up here, this is the posters for the national parks. And this is called titled 6 Steps in the Silkscreen Process. And here are the 6 photographs. Now we've accounted for this one here and this one here, and this one here, but we cannot find, we have this one, but we do not have this one, and we do not have this one. And here's an artist designing a poster, but we cannot identify who this is. So there may have been other artists. I started with maps, and that's how the Western Museum Lab started, I think. We're creating these 3-dimensional maps. And Ansel Hall, coming from Yosemite, wanted to build this relief map at the Strawberry Canyon Camp. And this is the largest relief map ever built. It's 40 feet long, it's 10 feet high, comes in 3 panels, and each panel has 4 sections to it. So here's one big panel here. This center panel today is missing. We don't know where it is. But this panel and the left panel are right here. And they're in a pole shed up in El Portal, California, and collapsed over and opened. You can see here it's open to the elements. So when I saw these photographs in the archives a few years ago, I immediately called the parks. I drove over to El Portal and did an assessment of what they had as best I could. And today we have now salvaged these, and they're now sitting in the Air Force Base at Castle Air Force Base near Merced. And these are going to be part of a building that the University of California Merced is building. And there's a second map. They made lots of different kinds of maps. This is not WPA here, but this one is going to be repurposed. This is one that Ansel Hall built in 1923, and it came out of the building in 2023. That's last fall, and I was there to grab it. And it is also now going to be in the UC Merced system. I believe it'll be a centerpiece in the library. And the UC Merced is going to be a repository for a lot of the federal records coming out of national parks. And so this is going to be a perfect marriage, if you will, of repurposing these old maps. This one here I found is a CCC map, or WPA map, excuse me, of the Forest Service. And this is in the Santa Barbara courthouse. And I drove over and found that there are 29 of these maps that were built, and I don't know where the other ones are, but we're gonna we're gonna find out. This photograph again came with this decade of photographs that I just found, and this shows how the maps were made, and they literally layered up cardboard layers, and then they draped over, looks like wet tissue here, and they paper mache'd it in, and then they added painted details and whatnot. When I was a kid, I had a fascination for the same thing. And I made a map of Mount Rainier starting at 14,410 feet. And I got down to 10,000 feet, and I was cutting about 30, 40 feet of detailed contours, and I finally just gave up. So anyway, that was the end of that project. Now, the other thing that happened, I guess, after publishing the 14 original prints, and recall that I did not know what the colors were. That's the only missing information I didn't have. So when I started printing my copies of these screen prints, people started calling me and saying, hey, I got a print that looks like yours, but it's a different color. What's going on? And I knew they had originals. Now, this came out of the park archives. It was actually in the file drawer all the time. Nobody knew it was there. And it was Tessie Shirakawa who pulled it up and called me up. She was so excited. So I got in my car and I drove down to Petrified Forest with a carload of inks. And we set up a protocol so I could go back and forth across the room. And I made this recipe map over here in the lower right. And it literally is just like a recipe in a cookbook. And I took it to my screen printer and we tossed out my colors. And this is what we now publish, this original one. Another thing that happened after the publication of these 14 was the Department of the Interior called, and we hatched a plan to do an exhibit of all these prints. And it lasted for 14 months. We had 16,000 attendees, or we had 49 serigraphs. We had the 14 original. We had a couple of See America prints of national parks, and we had my contemporary ones. The national parks came to me at these various meetings and encounters or whatever, and they asked, I think Devil's Tower was the first, and they asked me, well, could you make a 15th print and make it look like it fits in with the series? Well, absolutely I could. I knew the secrets by then. So I did a Devil's Tower was the first contemporary print, and now we're up to 60 prints. At the time of the exhibition in 14, we had a total of 49 prints, including these 14. It was the exhibition was opened by Secretary of Interior Sally Jewell. It lasted, like I said, 14 months. And after this exhibit, I took this exhibit on the road. I still owned the prints. And so I went to the Park Service and asked if we could make this part of the official centennial. And I got turned down, but I did it anyway on my own nickel. I drove, I was crazy. I fixed up an old trailer. I drove 44,000 miles in 15 months. I went to 187 park units, more or less. I gave 100 presentations and talks, audiences of 1 up to about 350 people. I was a keynote speaker for the Grand Canyon History Symposium, and I was a motivational speaker for Rolla Drums, the Shell Oil Company. And they were just absolute fans of national parks. And I challenged them to put up 1% of their gross receipts to fund our national parks. They take public domain out of the ground oil, and they should put something back in. And I'm still waiting to hear back from them, but several companies have done this. We started it in 1996, and that's my dinner bell going off here. We're just about done. And Patagonia has done that and contributed millions of dollars to our national parks. But anyway, I went through 2 cars and several flat tires. That was the end of that. This is C. Don Powell's son, Richard Powell. And he came up, I sent him up to Washington, D.C. during the exhibit so he could see his own father's work. He had never seen his father's work except for the 2 prints that he had in his own possession. These were taken from him by an imposter of me, and they disappeared for 19 years. It took the FBI to finally get these back. They are now back at the Harper's Ferry collection. It was not an easy task. It was Richard Powell and his wife, Nancy, in the exhibit. This is a couple of collections have turned up. This is the most prolific one of 10 screen prints, 9 of which were these national park ones. This is a French art collector and artist, in Los Angeles, and he purchased these for $70 a piece. I was in Antarctica at the time. I couldn't get up to Los Angeles. I pleaded with him, do not sell these at auction and do not split them up. And that's exactly what happened. 2 years later, this Grand Canyon print sold for $9,000. All 10 sold in 2 minutes. Library of Congress bought 5. I bought 2, and 2 went missing. And we've since relocated the one missing one, and that is Yosemite. It's the only known copy, and it has now also been donated back to the collection. And this is the other one that was the only known copy, came out of Santa Cruz, California. And this is the Yellowstone Geyser, the only known print. So this is where they are today. We have 40 prints that have survived out of 1,400, assuming 100 each. 33 of these 40 actual prints, and there's multiple copies, as you can see. 33 of these are back in the public domain. The bandolier had 12 in a file drawer, and they were cut in half, but a few survived intact. And of course, we just needed the information to put them, to rebuild the screens. We've still not found 2 of these prints. Wind Cave and Great Smoky Mountains have still yet to turn up. I have a $10,000 reward. If anybody can find one, I will pay you $10,000, and I will give it right back to you through the Library of Congress collections. They will probably go to the National Park Archives at Harper's Ferry. Those 2 Yellowstone prints here, 2 of these copies are now part of the Department of Interior Museum collection. We had some redundancy, so I didn't want to separate these up because they came from the same collection in Santa Cruz, so that's where they are today. But this is in the book that I have where they are today, and I think it's kind of fascinating. This is the donation ceremony. Here they are all in one room, and that's all I have to say. I would be happy to answer questions.
Sorry, I didn't unmute. Thank you, Doug. Let me just start off with a question, and then we'll get to I see some in the Q&A. I know there's great love out there for these National Park Service posters. I've heard from people. Could you share some of the responses that you've got from people that you've encountered? You know, I'm sure that there must be stories about the posters and, you know, people's appreciation for them.
Yeah, I've got hundreds, if not thousands of comments. I post quite a few on my website, rangerdoug.com. And I mean, some are just bring tears to your eyes. I mean, I think the best one I had was just one sentence. The guy said, I got my posters today in the mail. And he said, I've just been sitting here staring at them all day long. And, you know, I've got letters from 3 U.S. ambassadors. They've decorated their 3 embassies, U.S. embassies, with these prints to remind people of home. I've gotten letters from military people. We donate our blimps to the military, to hospitals, and to schools. We've gotten dozens of letters from teachers saying how important these are to the kids to see their national parks and motivate them to go visit. These designs were designed 80 years ago, and they're still encouraging people to visit their parks. And you know, it's heartwarming. I could go on all day with some of these other comments, but many of them are posted on my website.
Yeah, there is a question about the difference between posters and murals, and the WPA had different areas that it worked in. So what Doug is talking about is the WPA posters, which he's focused on national park, but then thousands of other ones were done for the purposes that I think you saw in one of the slides. Now, murals was a whole nother area that the WPA worked in. So what we've been focusing on tonight are these efforts, actually joint efforts between the WPA, the CCC, National Park Service, and some other New Deal agencies. There was a question about how many posters still exist, and I think Doug's slide was up there explaining that. Well, here's a very important question, Doug. What's the name of your book?
It's a bad pun. It's a Ranger of the Lost Art, and then the subtitle is Rediscovering the WPA Poster Art of Our National Parks. It's 224 pages, 400 illustrations, forward by Douglas Brinkley. It comes with a silkscreen print in the back cover, and it's worth every nickel of $100.
Yeah, I mean, that's an original print. And I think also say something about your website, because you've talked a lot about the work that you've done, and I know it's available through your website.
Yeah, the address is simply rangerdoug.com, and we, of course, retail any of these posters we sell. They're all handmade, hand screen prints. We use modern machines. We use UV inks now that are more environmentally friendly. We put a scuff coat on the top, but all those are available on the website. We have a few other trinket items that we sell in national park bookstores. There's quite a bit of history on there. Of course, the books on there. There's all the customer comments. There's a whole section on copyright that's quite interesting. Everybody asks about copyright and how does that work? And that's explained on the website under a copyright button. But I'll guarantee you, it'll fill a whole rainy day of reading if you want to read every page.
There's a comment and a question. Doug, you're a Sherlock Holmes, and this is clearly a labor of love, which is true. And, we have another colleague too, actually, maybe a few colleagues. Doug mentioned the help of Kathleen Duxbury, who actually went on an odyssey of over 100,000 miles, and her area is the art project in the Civilian Conservation Corps. So the question was, did you find any other descendants of the identified artist? And I will answer one part of that, and that's that actually Doug had photos of Elizabeth Gino, and the son of Elizabeth Gino lives here in Berkeley, California, John Ranovici, and he's very active with the Berkeley Historical Society, and he's helped us identify photos of his mom. And then, and we've seen actually some of her other artwork that was done for the Park Service. So have you met other descendants of the artists that you've identified, Doug?
No, we still have Nancy Russell from the National Park Archives at Harpers Ferry pointed out in those 6 silkscreen steps that there is another artist at the table, and we can't find out who that is because it's such a fuzzy photograph. And I'm still going to dig around and see if we can find that, but it's not at the San Bruno one. Of course, Dale Miller died in 2007. I could have interviewed him, but his identity was withheld by this fellow that took all his materials from the artist's estate and kept it secret to hide his theft. And this is why I got the FBI involved. It's all in the book, as they say. But that was the saddest day of my life, was realizing that we could have interviewed Dale Miller and mic'd him up. And we did. Richard Powell, the son of C. Don Powell, we did, when he went to Washington, they mic'd him up and he told what he could remember of his father's artwork and dealings with the CCC, but in the WPA. But that's really, it's just a tenuous thread of history here. Before the San Bruno discovery, this decade of artwork, I knew practically nothing. Even the National Park Archives had 6 months or more, just scattered shotgun pattern of history here and there, just a few months here, a few months there, very few photographs. In fact, they had virtually no photographs in Washington. But thanks to Kathleen Duxbury, she really pointed me in the right direction. I literally tore up the first manuscript of the book and started all over again.
A comment and a question. The posters decorate my home and bring me great joy. So there's a testimonial. The question is, what leads you to sell only the contemporary color designs for some posters, for example, Lassen Volcanic, versus selling only the restored original colors for others, for example, Yellowstone Falls?
Yeah, that's dictated by 2 things. One is the let's take Lassen. I just think the colors are ugly. I mean, I colored my Lassen twice as well. And the first edition, I had some brown in there for the pumice, and the park liked it. They said, that's what the pumice, it is brown. And then I made it blue and green, kind of taking after the Teton print because it's kind of stylized colors. And then the original turned up with this find in Los Angeles. This from Laurent was the fellow's name. And here it is, purple, yellow, brown, and puce. And And I always thought, well, this was the last one made in the series because they ran out of ink and that's all they had left on the shelf. But again, I'm wrong. That was printed about in the midway through these 14. But so why they picked the colors, I don't know. But the other thing that dictates is the market. It's the free market. And when I first colored the Yellowstone geyser, it's vibrant orange and blue. And it turns out that F.J. Haynes, who had his Haynes guidebook, used that same image that the WPA artist borrowed his image, okay, from his guidebook. And he even colored his black and white photographs in these vibrant oranges and blues like I did. But the WPA artist made him subdued blue and green for the Yellowstone geyser. But I can't sell that. I can sell one of those, but I can sell 10 of the orange ones. People prefer it. It's just the open market that makes that decision. Zion is another one. I colored Zion primary. I figured this is brick red, yellow, sunset, and pink skies, this kind of thing. And same with our contemporary Saguaro National Park. Very vibrant colors compared to what the WPA artists would use, but that's what people prefer in the marketplace. So Zion sells 10 to 1. My colors, the WPA colors, which are very subtle, not. And I happen to like the WPA colors on that one. However, I don't like the WPA colors on Lassen. So it's kind of both reasons. It's the market dictating it, and it's someday maybe I'll print all 14 exactly as they were. I've also made some other small changes. I put the date in the seal, like a nickel has a date on the bottom of a nickel with a bison on it, the old buffalo nickel. And that's just a hallmark I use, but I've cleaned up a lot of the art, made some changes, actually added some encryption in some of the designs just for copyright protection and a few other subtleties. But the colors, someday I may surprise you and come out with all the original colors. We'll see. It's very expensive to do that, by the way.
There's a question. What's the average number of screens that you use?
Typically, the WPA artists, they started with 4 with Teton, and that's the only one that has 4. And then typically they use 6 screens. But the second print they printed was 8, and that probably scared them off because that's the Grand Canyon print. And there was only one other that had 8 screens, and that was Petrified Forest, but all the rest had 6 screens. Today, on our contemporary ones, I started out with 6 screens with Devil's Tower, and now for Theodore Roosevelt National Park and Haleakala National Park and one other, we have now 10 Valle Caldera. It's a brand new national park here in New Mexico. Those 3 prints, we have 10 screens, and we sell these to the park wholesale for $25. That's $2.50 a screen, handmade silk screens. So it's a bargain.
Any coming attractions, any posters coming up?
Yes, I'm looking at the Hot Springs National Park. We've got the old 1930s old pots in oranges and blues, very pretty. We've got C&O Canals expressed an interest. Kennecott Mines, the Kennecott Wrangell St. Elias National Park. They commissioned, I went up there and talked to the park, and then I met with Alaska Geographic, which is the magazine that runs the Alaska parks. It's their magazine, I guess you'd call it. But it's the organization, I'm sorry, they bought the magazine's name. They've talked to me about doing all the Alaska parks. So we've started with Wrangell St. Elias. I've got 2 designs out for them. The Kennecott Mine was just approved. Mount Drum I've done, it'll be out in a postcard very soon. And let's see, there's a few others I'll think of in a minute.
Could you talk about the process a little bit? How, when you do a new park poster, how do you do that, in the style of the originals?
Well, I had the head of the Chicago Art Institute call me one day, and he said, "Now, I understand you've restored some of these old WPA prints." I said, "Yep." And he said, "Yeah, I understand you've made some contemporary ones." And then he says, "Which are which?" And he said, "You got me fooled." And he said, "Normally I can spot a phony in a minute." But he said, you guys have done a really good job. And I have to mention Brian Mabius here. He's my computer artist that we work together in tandem like WPA artists did. They conferred with each other. and group effort. And Brian and I have kind of figured this out now using computers, but we stick with certain fonts. We stick the silk screen process itself is very distinctive. They're block colors. There's no, it's very simple. It's not simple, but it's a simple design. It allows for simple designs. But once you figure it out, but we try to stylize, we don't take a photograph and just copy it. We stretch some, Teton is stretched vertically a little bit. There's all kinds of little tricks. Everybody is putting this Bauhaus font and the seal on everything today. Doormats and underwear, candy wrappers, soap wrappers, you name it, coffee bags. There's 20, 30 people out there doing this stuff today. And it's what can I say? I don't know if I answered that question.
Well, here's another testimonial for you. We have been national park fans for years. When we bought a home in Green Hills, Ohio, one of the 3 Greenbelt communities built by the New Deal, it only made sense to decorate our first floor in Parks Lodge style with the WPA poster reproductions in every room. Thank you so much for all you've done.
Well, thank you very much. That's a sweet comment. I'll get one of these a week, and I actually have photographs. I want people to send in photographs of their displays, and we're going to have a winner at the end of each year, and they're going to get a free book, autographed book. And this year's runner-up, this year's lead right now is 33 poster designs in his house, 33 prints in every room of the house. But it's not so much the numbers or anything else. It's kind of how the display is, innovation and whatnot. But anyway, free book to anybody who wants to join. Send in your photographs.
There's a question. Did you do the Glacier Bay poster and keychain that are sold in the ranger station?
Repeat that.
Did you do the Glacier Bay poster and a keychain that are sold in the ranger station?
We don't do any keychains or any of the offshore stuff. It's junk, in my opinion. I'm not sure what you mean by keychain, but we have a Glacier Bay print. It's on my website at rangerdoug.com. And it's based on the Alaska steamships. And it says, revisit the ice age on comfortable steamships. That's the headline or the leader line on the print. Again, it's an 8-color silk screen.
The question, have you done similar research into the See America WPA posters?
Yes, the See America, I'm not an expert at this any more than anybody else is, and just what I've read on your sites and whatever, but the U.S. Travel Bureau was absorbed by the Department of Interior. It was set up originally to promote national parks. And you got to remember that there was a lot of shuffling around all with these letters, this alphabet soup of things. But the See America prints, they did a lot they did a few state parks. They did a lot of Montana parks. And it's kind of a generic headline, and we've used that See America for like redwoods, because Redwood National Park is 4 national park, state and national park units, 129 groves formed over several decades. They're still adding and subtracting little pieces here and there. So we use the See America because we don't have a date for one day that park was formed, and so that's kind of a handy thing. We've actually had 5 new. You asked about new posters. We just did Howland Hills Stage Redwood in Redwood National Park, up by Crescent City. That's a new design out last week. It's on our website today. But that's another one we use to See America. We probably have 7 or 8 See America banners now.
These posters are inspirational. And there's a local organization here in the Bay Area called the Creative Action Network.
Yes.
And they actually put out a call for people to do their own riff on the See America.
Yeah.
And they actually got submissions from all over the world. You can go to their website, just Google Creative Action Network and see. It's pretty incredible.
I've heard of them. That's great.
Let's see. Wait, I had another question here. Okay, See America. Oh. Okay. Well, yeah, you answered this in your slide, but just maybe want to repeat, how many authentic posters still exist and which park has the most extant copies?
Well, that would be Bandelier has these 13, I think. It's either 12 or 13. They were all cut in half, and I didn't really make a count or fit them together. Could have been more with some halves missing. There's, of course, two parks, Wind Cave and Great Smoky. They've never found any. There are 14 designs and 40 surviving copies, assuming that there's 12 Bandeliers. And there's only, of all the known survivors, there's at least one copy in the public domain. So everything we know about these parks is now in the public domain. There are no hidden copies out there, the only copies. The Yosemite was the last one in the door. And I'd like to thank Chuck Boyce, a physician from Baltimore, Maryland, for his gracious donation of this single print. And offered to buy it. He wouldn't take my money. He said, I'll just donate it. So that just made it into the National Archives here at Harper's Ferry about probably a couple of years ago. And Dr. Boyce met me in Washington about a month ago, and I took him into the museum, and they shook his hand and thanked him for it. Thank you,
Okay,
Chuck.
this might be our final question. Have you looked at any other WPA art in the parks?
Yeah, and it's in my book, but only briefly. There's Jacob Assinger. Again, it was pointed out, I think, by Kathleen Duxbury. And he was a PWA, a paid artist, but he was hired to do national park posters. And they're quite interesting. I put a couple in the book just to show the style. Dorothy Waugh is mentioned a lot, but she was not a WPA artist, but she did a lot of state and national park, mainly winter scenes. And I put one of her representative prints in the book, although she was, there's quite a bit of connection with her and Albert Good and the Cuyahoga area, as I recall. I think she worked out there. So she's represented in the book. And of course, to See America, we have Alexander Dux and Frank Nicholson are the only two known artists by name that I've included in the book. I'd be interested if there were any other out there that I don't know about. I've certainly, done my share of searching around, but you never know what you're going to come up with. Never know.
Okay, Doug, I want to thank you so much. Obviously, it's clear to everybody this is an amazing odyssey. There's a lot of detective works. Calling you Sherlock Holmes is not an understatement. And I want to thank everybody listening or watching tonight. Thank you for your support. Our next webinar, The People's Recorder, about a new podcast based on interviews by the Federal Writers Project, will be Tuesday, June 11th. And we hope to see you then. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.